The call came in just after dawn. A hiker had found something in Cadoc Glenn Park, something that had left him shaken to the core. The officer on duty relayed the message with an urgency that immediately suggested the discovery was grim. I arrived at the scene as the morning sun barely crept over the horizon. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area, cutting through the serene beauty of the park with an ominous air. There, beneath the dense canopy of trees, lay a young woman's lifeless body. Her face bore the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle, disfigured and swollen beyond recognition. Her hands were grazed and bruised, as if she had fought desperately against an attacker. The smell of damp earth mingled with the metallic scent of blood, a nauseating reminder of the brutality that had taken place here. Her clothes were torn, scattered in fragments around her body. A forensic specialist murmured to me in a low voice that the evidence suggested sexual assault. Every detail felt heavier than the last. The dirt smudged across her arms and legs bore the marks of being dragged, leaving a trail that disappeared into the darkness of the surrounding woods. It was clear. Whoever had done this wanted to strip her not just of life, but of dignity. The photographer moved methodically, capturing each grim detail for the case file. My team and I fanned out, searching for any piece of evidence that might shed light on what had happened here. Nearby, broken branches and disturbed soil hinted at a violent confrontation. But it was the torn necklace lying near her outstretched hand that struck me, a small, delicate charm, now dusted with earth. It was the first sign of who she had been before this nightmare unfolded. I glanced at her face again, trying to hold back the surge of emotions threatening to break through. She couldn't have been more than 17. Someone had taken everything from her in those final moments, leaving behind only a shattered body and an overwhelming sense of loss. As we combed the area for clues, another officer approached, holding a smartphone in a gloved hand. It was hers, found a short distance away, its screen cracked but still functional. The last photo she had taken stared back at me, a selfie, smiling, with a young man standing beside her. The time stamp showed it had been taken less than 24 hours earlier. My stomach tightened as I realized this was no random crime. This was someone she had known, someone who had been close enough to earn her trust. The preliminary report from the forensic team came in. Strangulation marks around her neck were unmistakable, and there were signs of prolonged suffocation. The injury suggested not a quick, impulsive act but a deliberate, sustained attack. Her broken nose and fractured cheekbone told their own story of brutality. Whoever had done this had unleashed a level of violence that spoke to rage or something darker. The officer who had first arrived on the scene mentioned the call. The man who found the body hadn't just stumbled upon it, he'd confessed to something far worse. I made my way back to the station to meet him. Stephen Corrigan sat in the interrogation room, his head lowered, his hands trembling slightly. His appearance was unremarkable, but the words he had already spoken were anything but. He admitted to finding the body, to moving it from the trail. But then he said something that turned my stomach. He had assaulted her after she was dead. His voice was detached, almost clinical, as he explained his actions. It was as though he believed this confession would absolve him of his horror. Instead, it added a new layer to the nightmare. But Corrigan's alibi for the time of death checked out, leaving us with more questions than answers. If he wasn't the killer, who was? My thoughts turned back to the young man in the photo, the last person known to have been with her. The investigation had just begun, but the weight of it already pressed heavily on all of us. We left the park that morning with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: justice for her wasn't just a professional duty. It was a moral imperative. Whoever had done this would face the full weight of the law, no matter how long it took to find them. The young woman's name was Amber Gibson. 17 years old, with a bright smile and dreams of a future she'd never see. As her name came into focus, so too did the weight of the responsibility to uncover the truth. Back at the station, we pieced together the fragments of her life, starting with the last hours she was seen alive. Amber had left the orphanage where she lived, excited to meet someone she had spoken of often, her older brother, Cadoc Gibson. Her foster guardians, wary of their strained relationship, had granted permission for the meeting with caution. Yet Amber had seemed hopeful. Perhaps this time there would be peace between them. Connor's name quickly rose to the forefront of the investigation. He had been the last to see her alive, the brother in the photo she had posted shortly before her death. By the time we brought him in for questioning, the search for Amber had turned into a full-scale homicide investigation. Connor sat across from me, a wiry young man with piercing eyes that darted nervously around the room. His story was rehearsed, too clean. He admitted to meeting Amber that night, claiming they had taken a walk through Cadoc Glenn Park to catch up. But then, he said, they argued like they always did. He described how she had stormed off, leaving him to wander aimlessly before returning to his hostel. "What did you argue about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Stupid stuff," he said, avoiding my gaze. "She always got upset over nothing."
The words were hollow, a desperate attempt to distance himself from the crime. But his demeanor betrayed him, fidgeting hands, beads of sweat collecting on his brow. He was nervous, and not just because his sister was dead. There was something more, something he wasn't saying.
His alibi crumbled under scrutiny. Connor claimed he had wandered through town after leaving Amber, yet surveillance footage showed him heading directly back to his hostel. He had returned disheveled, his clothes soiled with dirt. When asked to explain, he faltered, mumbling something about falling into a ditch. But when we pressed him to identify the location, he couldn't or wouldn't recall. Forensics began to paint a damning picture. Amber's body bore traces of DNA that matched Connor's. His jacket, recovered from a dumpster near his hostel, was stained with Amber's blood. On his shoes, fragments of dirt and traces of her DNA tied him irrevocably to the scene. These weren't just coincidences, they were links in a chain of evidence that tightened around him with every passing hour. The revelations didn't stop there. Forensic analysis of Amber's torn clothing uncovered blood that wasn't hers. It was Connor's, likely from a scratch or wound inflicted during their struggle. The deeper we dug, the darker the truth became. Amber's body also bore evidence of sexual assault, and the DNA left behind matched her brother's. It was a detail that left even the most seasoned detectives in stunned silence. Connor's online activity further exposed his guilt. His search history revealed frantic queries: how to remove DNA evidence, how to erase phone data, and how long does it take for blood to disappear. The attempts to cover his tracks were as clumsy as they were incriminating. But the most chilling piece of evidence came from Connor's social media. Hours before Amber's body was discovered, Connor posted a message mourning her death. The question was clear: how could he have known she was dead when officially she was still missing? We brought Connor in for a second round of questioning. This time, the weight of the evidence pressed against him. He fidgeted more, his story shifting in small, telling ways. When confronted with the forensic findings, he grew defensive. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he blurted out suddenly, his voice cracking. "It was the slip we needed." "Hurt her how, Connor?" I pressed, my voice unwavering. He clammed up, shaking his head. But the words hung in the air, the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. Even as the evidence mounted, Connor's demeanor remained chillingly detached. He spoke of Amber in the past tense, his voice devoid of emotion. There was no grief, no remorse, only a calculated effort to downplay his involvement. It was as if Amber had been a stranger, not the sister he had grown up with. Every detail of the case weighed heavily on the team. Amber's life had been filled with challenges: a troubled upbringing, years of neglect, and a foster system that had tried but failed to shield her from harm. She had survived so much, only to face the ultimate betrayal at the hands of her own brother. The picture was becoming clearer, but the why remained elusive. What had driven Connor to such unspeakable violence? The answers lay somewhere in their shared past, a history scarred by abuse and neglect. As the investigation deepened, so too did the sense that this crime was the culmination of years of pain, anger, and unspoken truths. For now, we had what we needed to hold Connor. But the full story, one that began long before that fateful night, was only just beginning to unfold. The evidence against Connor Gibson was overwhelming, but the brutality of the crime begged for a deeper understanding. What could drive a brother to commit such an atrocity? As the team sifted through the layers of Connor's life, a disturbing portrait began to emerge: a young man shaped by violence, consumed by resentment, and capable of unimaginable cruelty. The search for answers took us back to Connor and Amber's childhood. The foster parents, Craig and Carol Neen, spoke hesitantly of their time with the siblings. They described Connor as a troubled boy, marked by the abuse he had endured under his biological father. While Amber had found solace in art and friendships, Connor's trauma festered. His outbursts of anger, particularly toward girls, had been apparent even in his early years. The Neens admitted they had kept Amber and Connor in separate schools to prevent conflicts, but the tension between them never truly eased. When Connor turned 18, he had chosen to leave the Neen household, moving into a shelter under the guise of independence. His departure had been a relief for everyone involved. Yet, despite their physical separation, the hostility simmered. Connor's social media was littered with cryptic posts hinting at his inner turmoil, dark jokes about death, cryptic references to past grievances. No one had taken them seriously. No one had seen the storm brewing. The Neens expressed their regret, but also their frustration. He was always distant, Craig Neen admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. We tried to help him, but he pushed everyone away. Amber deserved better than what he gave her. Forensic psychologists joined the investigation to unravel Connor's psyche. Their analysis painted a grim picture. Connor exhibited traits consistent with deep-seated psychological disorders, exacerbated by years of neglect and abuse. His resentment toward Amber, they speculated, stemmed from a toxic mixture of jealousy and misplaced anger. To him, Amber's ability to find moments of joy, despite their shared trauma, was a reminder of his own inability to heal. The night of the murder, investigators theorized, had been the culmination of this festering rage. Surveillance footage showed Connor leading Amber into the isolated parts of Cadoc Glenn Park. Witnesses later confirmed hearing raised voices, though no one intervened. The forensic evidence filled in the rest. Amber's injuries, blunt force trauma to the head, strangulation marks around her neck, told the story of an escalating attack. The broken nose, the hematoma, the bruises, each mark bore the imprint of Connor's rage. The sexual assault, confirmed by DNA evidence, was a grotesque act of dominance. It was the final degradation, the ultimate expression of his control over the sister he had grown to despise. As investigators pieced together the sequence of events, the sheer cruelty of Connor's actions left even seasoned officers shaken. But Connor wasn't the only monster lurking in Amber's tragic tale. Stephen Corrigan, the man who had discovered Amber's body and violated her lifeless form, presented a grotesque to the case. His DNA had been found in intimate areas of Amber's body, complicating the initial investigation. In his confession, Stephen claimed he had come across Amber's corpse while walking through the park and acted on an irresistible impulse. His words were chilling in their simplicity, devoid of remorse or understanding. Forensic evidence corroborated parts of Stephen's account. The dirt smeared on Amber's body, the broken branches nearby, they aligned with his admission of dragging her away from the trail. But the timeline was damning. Amber had died 2 days before Stephen's heinous act. He was not the murderer, but his involvement added another layer of horror to the tragedy. The trial of Stephen Corrigan was swift. His defense argued that his confession of necrophilia had been a poorly conceived joke, but the forensic evidence was irrefutable. Male bodily fluids, his DNA found in over 30 locations on Amber's body, there was no denying his guilt. The jury sentenced him to 9 years in prison, a punishment that felt like a mockery of the suffering he had inflicted. For the community, the revelation of Stephen's actions was a sickening blow. Amber's death had already shaken them, but the knowledge that her body had been further desecrated turned grief into outrage. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory, yet they were tinged with anger not just at the monsters who had hurt her, but at a system that had failed to protect her. Connor's trial was far more complex. His defense team leaned heavily on his troubled past, painting him as a victim of his circumstances. They argued that his actions, while reprehensible, were the product of a broken system that had ignored his cries for help. Social media posts, therapy records, everything was scrutinized for evidence of his deteriorating mental state. But the forensic evidence told a story of premeditation and brutality. Connor's discarded jacket, his blood-stained shoes, the traces of Amber's DNA on his clothing, each piece was a nail in the coffin of his defense. His internet searches for how to erase evidence, his calculated messages feigning concern for Amber's safety, they revealed a chilling lack of remorse. The prosecution highlighted the most damning evidence, Connor's own admission. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he had said during his second interrogation. Those words, coupled with the mountain of evidence, painted a picture of guilt that was impossible to deny. In the courtroom, Connor remained stoic, his expression a mask of indifference. When the verdict was read guilty of murder, assault, and sexual violence, he showed no reaction. The life sentence that followed, with eligibility for parole after 22 years, felt insufficient to those who had loved Amber. Stephen's 9-year sentence and Connor's conviction brought a semblance of justice, but it was a hollow victory. Amber's foster parents, her friends, and the community continued to grapple with the enormity of the loss. As an investigator, I had seen many dark cases, but this one lingered, a reminder of how cruelty and neglect could destroy lives in ways no one could fully comprehend. As I stood in the town square, the weight of Amber Gibson's case lingered like a storm cloud over Hamilton. The air was thick with the voices of a community in mourning, but beneath the sorrow was a simmering anger, a need for answers, accountability, and change. Every step in this investigation had been a journey through layers of pain, betrayal, and societal failure. The memorial in the park was growing daily. Flowers, photographs, and heartfelt messages covered the ground where Amber's life had ended. The site was a stark reminder of her stolen potential, a young life extinguished in an act of unimaginable violence. Yet, as an investigator, the tribute wasn't enough to quell the frustration. Justice had been delivered in court, but the scars left by this tragedy were far from healed. The press hounded the police station relentlessly. Every briefing was a delicate dance between sharing enough to satisfy the public and preserving the integrity of the case. The town wanted someone to blame, not just Connor Gibson, but the system that had failed Amber so profoundly, and they weren't wrong to demand more. Her foster parents, Craig and Carol Neen, had become central figures in the public's reckoning. Their intentions had been noble, their efforts tireless, but they now carried the weight of guilt for not recognizing the depth of Connor's darkness. Behind closed doors, they were broken. Craig's hands trembled as he spoke about Amber's dreams of becoming an artist, while Carol's eyes brimmed with tears every time she passed Amber's bedroom, now eerily silent. As I interviewed them once more for a post-trial report, their pain was palpable. She was scared of him, Carol admitted, her voice cracking. She told us, but we thought separating them at school was enough. We thought love could fix this. It wasn't just them. Every institution that had touched Connor and Amber's lives bore some measure of responsibility. The schools had seen Connor's outbursts, his morbid jokes, and his growing aggression. Yet, he was labeled a troubled boy and left to navigate his inner turmoil alone. The foster system had provided shelter, but little in the way of specialized care for two children so deeply scarred by their past. Even the justice system had blood on its hands. Stephen Corrigan, the man who desecrated Amber's body, was a name that should have never been free to walk among the innocent. His previous convictions painted a portrait of a predator who had slipped through the cracks time and again. When I looked through his files, the missed opportunities to stop him were glaring. A lenient judge here, a clerical error there, it was a trail of negligence that led directly to Amber's grave. The public outcry was deafening. Hamilton had become a town divided, grappling with its collective guilt. At community meetings, parents voiced their fears. How many more Connors or Corrigans were out there, slipping under the radar? Social workers spoke of overwhelming caseloads and underfunded programs, pleading for systemic reform. Meanwhile, Amber's friends painted murals in her memory, their bright colors a stark contrast to the darkness of her final days. As an investigator, it was my duty to present facts, not opinions. But facts alone couldn't capture the devastation this case had wrought. Walking through Amber's old school, I saw the empty seat in the art classroom where she once sat. Her unfinished paintings were pinned to a bulletin board, a haunting reminder of what could have been.
Connor's trial had exposed the raw nerve of sibling violence, a topic rarely discussed, let alone addressed. His calculated manipulation of Amber, his years of aggression, and his final act of brutality were a chilling case study in unchecked rage. Yet, even as I reviewed the evidence that had sealed his conviction, I couldn't shake the feeling that Connor was as much a product of his environment as he was a perpetrator.
His social media posts, filled with dark humor and veiled cries for help, painted a picture of a boy spiraling into a void. Teachers had noticed. Foster parents had noticed, but no one had the tools to intervene effectively. And so, Connor became a powder keg, his explosion devastating the one person who had always hoped for his redemption.
Amber's legacy was already taking shape. The government had announced new initiatives aimed at reforming the foster care system. Funding for mental health services was being increased, and programs addressing sibling violence were in development. But these measures felt like an apology whispered too late. Amber's face had become a symbol, her story a rallying cry for change, but none of it could bring her back.
At night, I found myself poring over the case files, unable to let go. Amber's torn clothing, the trail of blood in the park, Connor's discarded jacket, it was all there, burned into my memory. Even the text messages Connor had sent after her murder, pretending to search for her, were chilling in their cold calculation. The DNA evidence had been damning, but it was the digital footprint that revealed the depths of his depravity. The public demanded answers about Stephen Corrigan's role. How could someone desecrate a body and walk free for so long? His trial was a grotesque spectacle, with his father painting him as misunderstood and his ex-wife describing years of abuse. The jury didn't take long to convict him, but his actions highlighted a grim truth. Even in death, Amber wasn't safe. By the time the trial ended, the case had taken its toll on everyone involved. Reporters who had covered every grisly detail now spoke with trembling voices, their objectivity eroded by the sheer horror of what they had uncovered. Prosecutors, detectives, even the judge, they all carried the weight of this case long after the verdicts were read. I visited Amber's memorial one last time before submitting my final report. A group of schoolchildren had gathered there, their teacher explaining the importance of kindness and vigilance. As I watched, one of the girls placed a single sunflower on the memorial, whispering, "For Amber. For Amber." The words echoed in my mind as I walked away. This case had been a storm, leaving destruction in its wake. But like all storms, it had also cleared the air, forcing us to confront what we had ignored for too long. Amber's death was a tragedy, but her life, however brief, had sparked a reckoning. And that, perhaps, was the closest thing to justice we could give her. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the final sentence. Cadoc Gibson, convicted of the murder and assault of his sister Amber, was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Stephen Corrigan, the man who desecrated Amber's body, received a 9-year sentence. Justice in the eyes of the law had been served. Yet, as I left the courthouse that day, it was hard to feel any sense of victory. Amber's death had exposed failures at every level: familial, societal, and systemic. Her story became a grim symbol of the urgent need for reform. The scars left behind were not confined to the foster family who had tried to protect her or the friends who had loved her. They extended to an entire community, now grappling with the stark reality of what had been allowed to unfold in their midst. In my years as an investigator, I had seen cases of unimaginable cruelty. But there was something uniquely harrowing about this one. Perhaps it was the betrayal at its core, a brother turning on his sister, a bond meant to be sacred shattered in the most violent way. Or perhaps it was the aftermath, the desecration of Amber's body, the indifference of a predator who admitted his crime with chilling ease. As the dust settled, Hamilton began its slow process of healing. The park where Amber's body was found was renamed in her honor, and her vibrant spirit lived on in the murals her friends painted across the city. Community programs sprang up, advocating for mental health support, stronger protections for children, and better oversight in the foster care system. Amber's mother, visibly aged by grief, became a tireless advocate, her voice a rallying cry for change. The case files now rest in an archive, their pages filled with evidence, testimony, and the echoes of a young life cut short. I knew I would carry them with me, not just as a professional duty, but as a reminder of the fragility of life and the need for vigilance. Amber's story was over, but its lessons would not be forgotten. As I closed the file one last time, I thought of her, a young girl who had faced so much pain, yet still found joy in art, who had hoped for reconciliation, and who had been let down by the very systems meant to protect her. Her memory was a call to action, a reminder that every life, no matter how brief, deserves dignity and care. For Amber. Always for Amber.